Well, hello again, and yes, I'm back. I am back, but I'm grateful to see you back too. Scope management is the knowledge area this time. Again, this slide, this objective slide, is meant to be something you come back to once you've done the readings and done the study. You ought to be able to read through it and be conversational in all of these aspects. Now, here's our summary slide of all the 5 process groups and the processes inside of them. And remember, you are the yellow boxes, always integrating within the process groups. Today, we are talking about scope management. These are the yellowish orange boxes. So we've got a number of planning processes and a number of control processes. But notice, nowhere else. Scope is absolutely essential, but you'll have 6 processes in 2 process groups. Now, I wanted to just take a moment to come back and remind you that as you study for the exam, remember, some of the questions are based on the language. You've got to know the language. Others are based on process questions, and some are more philosophical questions, right? I think that's an important point to emphasize, and this is kind of that summary slide. Take your time, pause now, review it, and get a sense of where you're at. So there are scope isms I want to cover right up front before we jump into this. One is that in scope is about defining the objectives and then defining the requirements. So frankly, I just summarize it as the requirements, right? But here is the rule in scope management, that we do the work and only that work, right? And we control it to make sure we don't do extra work or less work. So there's a project scope, which is the work done to produce the deliverable that the project is about. And then there's also product scope. Be careful, that's the end result. That's the long term, long after the project, this product that we'll keep putting out like Tide with bleach, right? The project ended decades ago. The product scope continues. The scope must be formally approved, and it'll be signed off by your sponsor. There are requirements you'll gather from all the stakeholders. We'll show you how to do that. We do not ever allow gold plating in predictive project management. Never. Gold plating is bad. That means formally adding functionality that the stakeholders didn't call for, right? Because it adds unnecessary time, cost, and risk, etc. to your project. We do not gold plate, and we work to control changes. Okay. In the scope management processes, they are listed here, right? And you see them as 6 processes. In plan scope management, notice your scope will be evaluated against the business document. So if you remember, I said for building that Golden Gate Bridge, right? The charter developed from the business documents talked about, still at a high level, building, 4 lanes each side, a bike lane, a pedestrian lane, etc. And the requirements are going to be pulled from the business documents, from the charter in this planning process. Then we're going to collect all the requirements. My favorite thing to do are stakeholder interviews, but you'll collect all the requirements and write them down. Then we will define the scope, and this must be formally defined and approved. In Agile, know that it's much less formal and much less well-defined, right? Agile is change-driven, and you're working on it all the time. But in predictive or waterfall, not so much. Now, then we'll create a work breakdown structure. So we'll take that scope statement that is an output of defined scope, and we'll break it down into parts and pieces. That's in predictive project management. In Agile, we might use a mind map, or a product backlog is the equivalent of a work breakdown structure. And in validate scope, that's where we take the product to the customer to formally accept it, or if they don't, to request changes. And of course, we're always controlling scope. Okay, so moving on, scope key concepts, right? Scope is about the requirements, the project scope to produce the deliverable, where the product scope long term is going to be more about the features and functions, right? So just realize that in an agile adaptive life cycle, the scope is really the product backlog. So you'll have a backlog of stories, and that's really what the scope is about. Okay. Predictive projects will use a predictive life cycle, right? And the scope baseline will be formally defined. And remember, we defined that the scope baseline is that approved version of the scope. It's also helpful to know what the definition of it is of a requirement. A requirement is a condition or capability that must be present in a product, service, or result, which you know is the definition of a deliverable. So the definition of a requirement is worth knowing, the condition that must be present in the deliverable. Now, plan scope management was our first process, and it's got your typical inputs, tools, and outputs, right? But normally when I plan a management plan, I end up with the management plan as the output, and I just get one. This is kind of an odd one because I have two management plans. So even though the process is called plan scope management, I'll end up with two management plans. One is the scope management plan, which is your typical how I'm going to define and control scope management in the overall project plan. The other one, called the requirements management plan, this is about how I'm going to analyze and prioritize the requirements. And that's really the distinction. This is kind of a one-slide summary of the difference, with these next two slides, the difference between the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. And I realize there's a razor-thin margin, but it's still a distinction that we want to know. Remember, scope management plan is focused on defining, monitoring, and controlling the scope. It's a typical management plan. It's how I'm going to define and control it. Your requirements management plan is a review, sometimes called the business analysis plan, because a BA or a business analyst will normally collect your requirements. But this is about listing and then prioritizing, approving, and tracking the very detailed requirements that you determined. This tracks the list. Okay, so that's the difference between them. After I plan scope management, I end up with two outputs, the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. Then I'm going to go collect requirements, right? And you'll collect requirements in an iterative fashion regularly throughout the project. And it's stakeholders that give you the requirements. Sometimes they're internal to the company, sometimes they're external. But they become the foundation of everything you will do. Remember, if it's not in the scope, it's not in your project. I'll say it later. If it's not in your work breakdown structure, which is part of scope, it is not in your project. So we defined a requirement already, but now it's further important to emphasize that a requirement is a deliverable that is quantifiable, testable, and traceable to satisfy stakeholders. Quantifiable, testable, traceable. That will be on the exam, I have no doubt. Now, my inputs are many, so it makes sense that my project management plan, whatever I've built of it so far, would be an input. My project charter had high-level requirements. My business documents listed why the project was even needed, right? That's clearly a requirement. And then, of course, contracts or agreements are also a requirement. So these are places to collect requirements. The tools are many, so it gets its own slide by itself. The tool that I like best is interviewing. Interviewing is a great tool. But in addition to interviewing, there are some other great tools like data gathering. I can gather data by brainstorming with others and benchmarking off of other best practices. If I see a great product out there, I'm going to steal its good idea. That's benchmarking. And I will also prioritize brainstorming with nominal group technique. You can look that definition up in the back of the PMBOK guide. Now, decision making often includes voting, and voting can be unanimous, autocratic, so I can tell you what the decision is, majority, or plurality. Plurality means the largest of the minority opinions. So you might get 30%, 20%, 18%, 12%, and another 10% or something. The majority of those minorities, that's the winner. That's a plurality. So I can take my data and represent it as an affinity diagram, which means just putting things into buckets or groups. I can run a facilitation, which are people with different perspectives. That I've seen on exams. When you run a facilitation group, when have people with different perspectives, like maybe children and adults and aunts and uncles, things like that. A focus group are people with the same specialty. Now, you want to be careful when you're collecting your requirements, because to implement, if a requirement is not found early in the project, it is very expensive later to make the change, right? And look, at the end of the project in phase 4, it is not easy to make the change. It has a high cost, stakeholders get very interested, and it complicates the functionality. You really want to find all of the requirements early in the project when it has a low impact, it's easy to implement, has low cost, stakeholders, they got it, you're developing it, and it's functionally not a problem, right? You'll want to spend a lot of time collecting requirements. Now, in an agile or a hybrid project, you will collect them over time as you do each sprint. Now, so to collect requirements, my outputs are two: my requirements documentation and a requirements traceability matrix. The requirements documentation, this documents the needs as traceable, unambiguous, complete. Remember the definition of requirements? This is where I'm documenting those needs as traceable and complete and unambiguous. I may even classify them into groups like businesses, stakeholders, a solution requirement, a transition requirement like training, right? Things like that. But the other one I love is a requirements traceability matrix. And that links your corporate strategy to the output objectives through these requirements. And I just wanted to share this very, very important definition. So before being baselined, we collect the requirements. The requirements documentation defined is to make sure that the requirements are unambiguous, traceable, complete, consistent, and acceptable. That will be on the exam. This is what a requirements traceability matrix would look like. And remember, it's linking the strategy to the objectives or overall objectives through these requirements. So I'm going to list the requirements here, and I'm going to write down why that's a requirement. Well, it was written in the charter, or it was written in the design document, or the government requires it as a regulation. Those are valid requirements for sure. And so as we transition then, we've collected all the requirements. Now we want to go define the scope. Remember this rule: good requirements lead to good deliverables. Good requirements lead to good deliverables. We're going to take a short break and come back right here with define scope process.